and welcome everyone to this September 13th, 2023 City Council work session and meeting of the Eugene Urban Renewal Agency. Thank you for joining us in this virtual meeting format. For work sessions like this one, where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcast and meeting materials web page. And again, thank you for joining us. It's good to see everybody. And with that, I call this work session to order, and I will turn it over to the city manager.
Thank you, Mayor. Our first topic is around the climate-friendly, equitable communities work. Again, we're going to be back talking about parking, and I believe I'm turning it over to Reed Verner to kick off with the presentation.
All right. Hello, my name is Reed Verner, and I'm the Land Use Supervisor with Building and Permit Services. With me this afternoon is Lydia Bishop, BPS Division Manager, and Leah Rausch from the Planning Division. We're here this afternoon for a work session on the Climate-Friendly and Equitable Communities, or CFEC, Parking Reform Land Use Code Amendments in preparation for next week's public hearing. Here is our agenda for this afternoon's presentation. We're going to start with a quick refresher on the components of the state's rule changes. The focus on the presentation will be on the Parking Reform Land Use Code Amendments, but we will also provide an overview of the different reform options available to the city. Next, we'll provide a summary of the feedback we received from the community through our public engagement. We'll then discuss a summary of the draft Land Use Code Amendments that were recommended by the Planning Commission. Finally, we'll cover the next steps in the process and we'll answer any questions that you have on the parking reform requirements. So CFEC is a state of Oregon directed multi-year mandate that went into effect in August of 2022. The rule changes have the purpose to advance goals regarding climate action, housing production, and transportation. Several projects will be needed to implement the new rules, and they generally fall into 4 buckets. The first is parking, which includes parking reform and preparing for a future with more electric vehicles. Our deadline to comply with the CFEC parking reform requirements is the end of this year. Next is the climate-friendly areas, which is planning for some areas to have higher density housing coupled with more active transportation facilities that allows people to get around without relying on a car. This designation will be implemented in 2026. Next is the climate-friendly transportation, which includes updates to the Transportation Systems Plan, or TSP, implementing a preferred scenario plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, and updating bike parking requirements. This work will take place through 2029 as we update our TSP. And finally, compact development, which includes updating the land use code to implement pedestrian-friendly and compact development standards. This work will happen concurrently with the TSP update through 2029. Today, we're going to focus specifically on the parking rules implementation. The first component of the CFEC rule changes to go into effect are the rules that impact how or if cities will require minimum off-street parking for developments and redevelopments of property. For some background, prior to the implementation of CFEC, the City of Eugene's land use code would require a number of off-street parking spaces for the development and redevelopment of properties based on specific ratios for the use type and the size of the use. The code also had rules for maximum off-street parking provided for commercial and industrial developments only. There were areas of the city that were exempt from off-street parking requirements, like the downtown and West University areas, but in the remainder of the city, minimum off-street parking requirements were strictly enforced, which limited how owners developed their properties and often posed an obstacle for many developments. Here's a rundown on the timeline for the state's required parking reform actions. I want to clarify right off the bat that these changes impact whether the city can require off-street parking, and regardless of the reforms that the city makes, property owners will still be able to build off-street parking if they choose to, or if financing or other market demands require them to build parking. The first changes kicked in automatically at the end of last year. The state rules reduced minimum parking requirements for some uses. Additionally, the rules stated that the city may no longer require off-street parking for properties located within 1/2 mile of frequent transit corridors, which we'll show a map of on the next slide. The state rules also identified a list of specific uses where the city can no longer require minimum off-street parking spaces, including childcare facilities, affordable housing developments, and dwelling units smaller than 750 square feet. Next was the new electric vehicle charging capacity rules that took effect after March 31st this year. And those rules require that new parking spaces built for developments with 5 or more dwelling units provide EV charging conduit, so the pipes that will eventually be able to be expanded to have electrical lines, they had to have those conduits serving 40% of the parking spaces built on site. Finally, by the end of this year, the city is required to adopt a land use code amendment that implements the rest of the parking reforms by choosing one of 3 options and implementing other parking regulations depending on the option chosen. Based on the limited time frame allowed by the state's rules and the feedback from public engagement, which we'll cover later, the proposed land use code amendment that is the subject of this work session implements option 1, which removes minimum parking requirements citywide. In addition to being the most straightforward to draft and implement, and being the most equitable citywide, most stakeholders and survey respondents expressed a preference for option 1. Additionally, the Planning Commission voted unanimously to recommend the code amendments implementing option 1 at their August 1st work session. A big reason for this preference is that no matter what option the city chooses, we won't be able to require parking in all of the areas shaded on this map, which includes all lots that are located within 1/2 mile of frequent transit corridors. The blue lines indicate those frequent transit corridors, which the state defines as transit lines that have 4 or more stops per hour at peak times. We know this map can be difficult to see in a PowerPoint presentation, but we have included a larger version as attachment D in the agenda materials that shows individual tax lots. 45% of the land and 52% of the city's population is located inside of these areas in which the CFEC rules prohibit requiring off-street parking. The majority of the commercial and higher density residential land is located in the parking exempt areas, while almost 2/3 of the land located outside of the parking exempt area is zoned R1 low density residential. The main takeaway here is that regardless of what option the city chooses, we won't be able to require off-street parking in this area and for those identified uses, including childcare facilities, affordable housing developments, public supported housing, shelters, and dwelling units smaller than 750 square feet. By the end of this year, the city must choose between the available parking reform options. Option 1 is to eliminate all minimum parking requirements. This does not mean that parking won't be built, but it will instead leave it up to property owners to decide whether they want to devote space to off-street parking or other uses. The Planning Commission unanimously voted to recommend the Land Use Code amendments implementing option 1. Option 2A and option 2B would allow the city to retain limited off-street parking requirements in certain areas and for some uses, but they would also require choosing from other rules and requirements specified by the state that will impact how parking would be regulated going forward. Option 2A or 2B would require changes to codes other than the Land Use Code. The details of the state's requirements for options 2A and 2B are provided in attachment B of the agenda. Here's a table that summarizes some of the differences between the options. Option 1 again is to remove all minimum off-street parking requirements citywide. It's the most straightforward option, and the same rules would apply for the entire city. This option would allow for all property owners and developers to decide whether to build parking based on market needs or other demands, or to utilize the space with other uses like more housing units or gardens, trees, bike parking, or other amenities. It was the most favored option throughout public engagement and was recommended by the Planning Commission. It was also the option chosen by all 8 Oregon cities that have passed ordinances to implement the CFEC parking requirements at this time. Implementing option 1 would also allow the city to explore other parking reforms that would mitigate potential issues caused by developments that don't provide parking. Options 2A and 2B require a list of other specific parking reform regulations. These options would entail having different parking rules for different areas of the city. The specifics involved in implementing either option 2 are quite detailed and would require new regulations and compliance monitoring. For instance, some of the rules in option 2 include required unbundling, which means that the city would have to require that parking spaces be rented, leased, or sold separately from the cost of the dwelling unit or leased commercial spaces. It's worth noting that the unbundling requirement would apply not just to new developments, but also existing developments when leases are created or renewed. Other policy choices for option 2 include a new tax on commercial parking lot revenue or adopting a list of 14 specific policies that include repealing parking mandates for many specific uses and development types. I'm going to now turn it over to Leah for a summary of the public involvement feedback.
Thanks, Reed. Good afternoon, councilors. As Reed said, my name is Leah Rausch, and I'm an associate planner in the city's planning division. As I think is probably obvious at this point, there's a lot to digest in each of the options in front of us. We knew that this project was one where we wanted to offer more opportunities for meaningful and inclusive community engagement than would have been achievable under the original parking reform adoption deadline of June 30th of this year. As directed by council, staff submitted and received a 6-month timeline extension from the state, specifically to provide more time for engagement. The focus of our outreach was to center the voices of historically marginalized community groups and to distribute information broadly across our community, as it will be for each CFEC implementation project. The city contracted with Julie Fisher to support public involvement between March and May of this year. During that time, the city hosted individual stakeholder interviews, facilitated small group discussions, engaged in discussions with people at 2 different big tabling events, offered a virtual information session, and collected about 440 online survey responses. Involvement also included proactive outreach to communities of color, the LGBTQ+ community, Spanish-speaking residents, people experiencing disabilities, neighborhood groups, and our partners working in affordable housing, transportation, environment, and development. So, what did we hear? The general public, including folks from historically marginalized community groups, understandably had a difficult time weighing option 1 versus option 2. Through engagement, as Rita said, we did hear strong stakeholder support and planning commission support for option 1. Community members told us that they valued reducing greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles and increased flexibility for the use of space that's currently dedicated to parking, whether that be for trees and green space or to accommodate more housing. People also emphasized that realistically, their lives continue to depend on car travel to access their daily needs. In-person outreach revealed both some opportunities and fears around these big picture proposed changes. Housing, environmental, transportation, and development advocates strongly prefer option 1, removing all parking mandates. They encourage the city to keep it simple by reducing regulations and complexities within our land use code. There was some interest from outreach participants in adding locally selected policies to option 1 to address or mitigate neighborhood impacts and resident concerns. They generally understood that option 1 provided more flexibility for the city and community to choose those strategies. That said, several neighborhood liaisons and advocates for people experiencing disabilities wanted to retain at least some regulations and favored option 2. There were some important concerns shared about how reforms would impact people who rely on van accessible transportation or use our sidewalk network to access transit. Accessibility advocates noted that there are already challenges with ADA parking enforcement that could get worse with less parking available citywide. The Planning Commission responded to these concerns and, as Reed will describe, integrated additional ADA parking requirements within the proposed code amendments in front of you. Outreach participants also asked important questions regarding implementation, such as how will the city coordinate with LTD to ensure convenient and frequent transit access, and how will neighborhood impacts be monitored and mitigated? In summary, when asked about outcomes of parking reform, people overwhelmingly supported more flexibility in how space is used and encouraging more housing production and climate-friendly transportation options, such as walking, biking, and taking the bus. So I'll just end this by saying it's obviously not an easy topic to engage around. We all know people have strong feelings about parking, especially in their neighborhoods. That said, our community continues to support strategies to reduce emissions and provide more housing options. They generally did understand that rethinking the way that we require parking is an important part of achieving those outcomes. With that, I'll hand it back to Reed to talk about the draft code amendments.
Thanks, Leah. The next portion of the presentation provides a summary of the proposed land use code amendments, which were included in the agenda materials as attachment A. The main change is to remove all minimum off-street parking requirements. Therefore, the majority of the proposed code changes involve removing references to off-street parking minimums and other related requirements. The CFEC rules also require reassessing parking maximums, including those for multi-unit developments. Prior to CFEC, the city's land use code had parking maximums for non-residential uses, and to maintain consistency with our prior policy decisions, the code amendments apply parking maximums citywide for commercial, industrial, and multi-unit residential developments. The amendments also comply with the CFEC rules that require tree canopy or solar panels for large parking lots that are over a half acre in size. The amendments also include the required size limitation on total surface parking areas for facilities over 65,000 square feet. And as Leah mentioned, based on public feedback from disability groups and a request from the Planning Commission, the code amendments include a provision that would require one ADA van accessible parking space for certain larger developments, even if a developer or property owner chooses not to provide any other off-street parking. This is in line with state building code allowances. The amendments also include the EV charging capacity requirements already in effect. Additionally, as the prior versions of the code were silent on the locations of EV charging stations, the proposed code would allow charging stations and ancillary equipment to be located in landscape areas and also in required setbacks if the charging stations are not more than 42 inches in height. Finally, the code amendments include some other housekeeping items and clarifications as needed. Here are the next steps in complying with the parking reform mandates. The City Council public hearing on the ordinance implementing the land use code amendments will be held on September 18th. Deliberations are tentatively scheduled for October, and the land use code amendments must be in effect by December 31st, 2023. Otherwise, the city won't be able to require off-street parking starting at the first of next year. This concludes our presentation. We're happy to answer any questions that you have on the parking reform requirements.
Okay, thank you very much. That was very clear for something that is really very complicated, but I appreciate the theme of keeping it simple. So thank you for that. And I will ask counselors, if at all possible, to have your cameras on, because it's just a little bit easier for me to see. I know that Councilor Keating is in transit. So, all right, I have Randy and then Alan.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, I'm really concerned about the state's changes here. I think it ignores reality and defies common sense. But with that said, can somebody explain to me how reducing off-street parking is going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Anyone?
I think the idea is that going forward, if developers get the flexibility to choose whether they want to provide parking or not to provide parking, that there might be some, for instance, multi-unit apartments going in that are closer to transit lines or closer to downtown, that they might decide to choose to not provide parking, which would allow people who don't have cars, who don't rely on automobiles, to choose to live there, and they wouldn't have to then pay and subsidize the parking for people that do have vehicles. Short answer, there's more to it than that, but I think that's the main thesis of the direction that we want to go in.
My daughter lives in Baltimore, which is a very congested city, very little on-street parking with skinny streets. And she's relied on the bus for years, but the bus service has become very unreliable, and she's finally had to get a car. And what she does is ends up driving around a lot more than she normally would because there's no place to park and she's hunting for a parking place. And that's my fear with this. I'm also worried about the impact on neighborhoods. The other thing is we have a conflict here between skinny streets that we seem to have grown a penchant for, where you can only have parking on one side of the street. That eliminates more on-street parking. So if you add that with the cutouts for driveways and other things, this just seems like a convergent of policy and theology, or not theology, but we're working towards something that I just think is going to cause us tremendous problems. And I'm not comfortable with this, although I understand we have to adopt certain things that the state is mandating. That's all I have for now, Mayor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Alan?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of these rules either. I don't like a lot of it. I think it's too much, too fast. It should be phased in over time. In fact, we do not need these rules to meet our greenhouse gas emission reduction targets in the state of Oregon. That's verifiable. I do like the EV requirements. We have 68,000 EVs in Oregon. 16% of sales are EVs. That's second only to California. But still, we only have 2% of the statewide is EVs. A little higher probably in Eugene. And we do have the EQC put in place the rule for the landscaping cars too, which requires 100% of car sales to be EVs by 2035. But we still have a lot of internal combustion engine gasoline vehicles for the foreseeable future for many, many years, and a lot of cars. With regard to the parking, I know this only is for new development, not existing development. But the theory is, to answer Randy's question, is that if we make it more difficult to park, then we'll get less cars and we'll get more alternative mode shift to bike ped transit. My experience is this theory is seriously flawed and it's not going to happen. We're not going to see a decrease in cars significantly, and we're not going to see a significant decrease in greenhouse gas emissions. In Ward 3, I know we have a lot of high rises, and those people don't bring their cars because they choose to live like that. But the ones that move out into the neighborhood, they do. And the ones that are in middle housing or have 5 people per house, they all bring cars, most of them. And so where are they all going to go if we don't have parking in these new development? What will happen is they're pushing this out into the neighborhoods and making it a neighborhood problem. I fear that we're just racing ahead, blundering into a ton of unintended consequences without any real viable solutions to this. But fortunately, I think developers and lenders both know that parking is important and essential. And lenders will probably likely to require parking. And developers know that it'll be hard to sell a place without parking. So I think the market will actually, in this instance, help mitigate the unintended consequences by providing parking and those bad consequences. But like Randy, I understand this is a state law and we have to abide by it. I don't have to like it, just future councils are going to have a fun time dealing with all these unintended consequences because of this rule.
Okay, thank you. Emily and then Matt.
Sorry, I have a new computer and it's really being a challenge. I understand the implications for our climate, but we do have to do this. And I think that if we take what the state has said we should do without changes, that we can still change it later. But if we don't accept anything, then we're just stuck with what the state said we had to do. So I'm really in favor of going ahead with Plan 1, realizing, as Alan said, that properties with parking are going to be more desirable. So developers would be motivated to include it. I really appreciate that this is more equitable. And because we can see how it goes, if it's not, we can change it within the parameters the state has given us. Doing the other plans is still going to be a major change. And one thing that I find very distressing is that it would just take up so much staff time. And we have many critical issues that we need the planning department to be working on. So I think it would be prudent financially, time-wise, and to preserve the ability to change later, to go ahead with Plan 1 and be done with it for now and see what happens. Thank you.
Thank you. Matt.
Thank you, Mayor. My Zoom froze, so I didn't catch all of what Emily was saying, but I really want to appreciate both Randy and Alan's perspective and share my concern, both for the lack of home rule that we're witnessing with a one-size-fits-all from the state, and my consternation about a one-size-fits-all throughout our community. I'll speak only to the South Hills because there are streets that are already narrow, and I'm highly concerned, as Randy articulated, about the public safety piece, adding yet more cars to the street that are already crowded. Concerned from a disability justice perspective, and if we as a community, and this council in particular, really wants to accelerate and encourage electric vehicle use, but at the same time we're encouraging building without off-street parking to actually hook up said electric vehicles, I find that as a bit of a head-scratching disconnect. I recognize that there are incentives and there's a plan in place. Will, I appreciate you illustrating and Alan, the electric vehicle off street parking spaces or on street parking spaces, but why would we want to support less off street parking for e-vehicles? And why would, let me phrase it this way. Has there been a study done in other communities that have done something similar that are going to detach, moving away from the electric vehicle piece, that are detaching parking from units, and that will have an adverse effect on renters? Not talking commercial, I'm talking residential. That would have an adverse effect on renters who would then have to pay more to have the quote unquote luxury of off-street parking.
Councillor Keating, I think we can provide some information on what some other communities have done and some of the results. I believe the state has that information, and we'll try to include that in the packet we prepare for the public hearing next week.
Okay, thank you. I am in transit, so I can't turn on my monitor as the mayor referenced. So I'll go back to telephonic audio monitoring, but I appreciate my colleagues sharing my concerns, and I would appreciate some more information before we have to make such a difficult and sadly disturbing decision. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I see Emily looking for a second round. Is anyone who hasn't had a first round wanting a moment to speak? All right, Emily, go ahead.
Thank you. About the electric vehicles on the street, of course we want more, and I'm still hoping developers in areas that would want more would build them, but I realize that costs money. However, electrical vehicles on the street, they can't charge there. You can't have your extension cord going out to the street. So you have to go somewhere else to, well, like getting gas. I guess it's the same. But I am concerned about extension cords across the sidewalks, which I guess is a separate topic. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Greg.
Thanks, Mayor. I may have to take a pass now. I'm still trying to formulate the questions that I have around options 2A and 2B. So I'll come back to this maybe a little bit later on that. But I'm trying to disaggregate some of those options as a way of us getting to more equitable policy development. So,
Okay, well, I'll turn back to you when you're ready. Alan.
Yeah, I ran out of time. I was going to mention EV charging as well. EV charging without parking doesn't really work. It'll be very, very difficult and very inequitable in terms of, I don't see how that's going to be equitable. As we build up the EV fleet, we need more charging. And where are all these EVs that we're going to get into the system going to charge if they can't charge on site? For the foreseeable future, hardwired charging is the way to go. Non-hardwired charging, the other technologies, is very nascent, very new. It's going to take a very long time to institute and adopt over time. It'd be very expensive when it does come on the market. And the current build out of EV charging does not at all envision no on-site parking. It relies on on-site parking. I think we have a big, huge disconnect with LCDC with what they're trying to do between EV promotion that DEQ is doing and this no parking. I think it's a big mistake. I'm interested in hearing what people have to say in the public hearing at the comments, but a little guidance for people doing that. Like the M Stadium conversation, I don't think it'll be really helpful to tell us why you don't like it. That we don't like it, and if you do have to say that, be brief about that part. But what I know people don't like it, so I encourage people to really be focused on solutions and the options in front of us. We have to institute this. It's not our rule. It's not our doing. We have to do this as a state law. And so we have to choose between option 1 and 2A and 2B. That the question isn't whether or not we should do this or not. That's a given. We have to do it. So it's really, how do we do it? And the more we can have testimony focus on solutions and the choice of the options, I think the better off council is going to be in understanding where people are coming from. I understand that the option 1 was unanimous choice of the planning commission and the majority of people, and that seems to be the front runner option at this point. And it's the most straightforward and most simple, and keeping it simple in this case is probably the way to go. But I'm really interested in hearing what people have to say.
Thank you for that. Anyone else, Greg? Are you ready to come back? Not yet. Okay, so I'll just say a couple of things. I was really happy with what you, glad to hear what you just said, Alan, because I think the issue before us is which of these options is going to work, and it does. You know, we all the time hear from constituents, especially people who are developers and building things, like keep it simple, keep it simple. And so it seems to me that the pathway of simplicity makes the most sense, especially looking at that map of, you know, how much of the city is already embraced automatically with the existing rules. That kind of clarity is great. And keeping in mind that developers can still choose to build parking, and many of them will. I do think it'll be interesting to see how this actually works in terms of equity, because we did, when we passed the middle housing code, we reduced parking requirements for middle housing code that was close to transit. And we did that because it was a way of reducing the cost of building that housing. It was a step that the council took to try and make it more affordable. So potentially this augments that impact, and it actually helps us increase the supply of more affordable housing. But then there is the question of whether it just means there's another element of haves and have-nots, that the more prosperous, more expensive housing will get parking because people are willing to pay for it. And so I think that it really does sort of remain to be seen. The other question that I have, and I haven't connected all the dots, is how this might relate. If you think of someone not having charging infrastructure at their house, but having the charging structure, for instance, in a public parking garage or in a public parking lot, if that, is there can we integrate those two things either through, I don't know if infrastructure investments are there or, where that might come from, but is there a way in which the city kind of steps more aggressively into that space of the public charging that's available, so people who are commuting can plug in for a few hours, charge up their car for the day? Oh, and with that, I will turn it back over to Greg.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. Question for staff. As we look at options 2A and 2B, I'm specifically drilling down on option 2A and number 4. We could adopt all of these policies, all 5 of the policies that are suggested here, or we could develop 2 or adopt 2 of the 5 or whatever combination that we come up with. Can you give me some more illumination, insight on what a tax on parking lot revenue would look like? How much are we talking? What percentages are we talking? And how would that ultimately be a benefit if we were to implement that particular policy? Staff?
So the new tax on commercial parking lot revenue, we haven't really delved into exactly how that would be accomplished, but we know it wouldn't be able to be handled through just a land use code amendment. That's due to the timeline and the public engagement. We went forward with option 1, which didn't include the new tax on commercial parking lot revenue. If that's something that council is interested in hearing more about, we can look into that more in depth and hopefully provide some more information by the next hearing. But we have not really studied the new commercial parking lot tax at this point.
And
yeah, I would like to get some more clarity around that. And then policy number 5, no more than 1/2 parking space per dwelling mandated for multi-unit developments. So I'm a little confused here, so forgive me on this one, but 1/2 parking space, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Are we talking about, you're saying half of a parking space for a particular dwelling development instead of having a 1-to-1 ratio in terms of that development? And then, what do you do with half of a parking space?
you always round up with the half count.
So then we are talking about 1 parking space, essentially.
Essentially, right. And so if there's 50 units and it's a half a space, then there would be 25. And if it's 1-to-1, it would be 50. And I just wanted to say, going back to your other question about the taxing, I'm not sure we can get a lot of information between now and next week when the public hearing is coming up on the details of the taxing. But I did want to remind the council, and I think Councilor Semple said this, that if the council is interested in some of the components of option 2A or 2B, we can look at those and add those later, right? You could choose to adopt the ordinance that we have in front of you and meet the state's timeline. Because if we don't meet the state's timeline, they will make us adopt what the state rules are, which frankly is not as good as the ordinance we have in front of you because it matches our code and does some other things that the public wanted. But the council can, after that, either completely repeal option 1 and go for 2A or 2B, or just look at some of those elements. So you will have that option in the future.
So if we adopt option 1, which is the most straightforward of all of this, we still have the opportunity to come back. And once we meet the state mandate deadline, we have the opportunity to come back and comb through the nuances of option 2A and 2B and add to the ordinance or take away from the ordinance based on what we think would best fit for our community. Correct?
That is correct.
All right. That helps a lot. And I would like to see something, hopefully by the time we get to the next phase of this, that further teases out what parking lot revenue, tax revenue looks like.
Okay, thank you. I see Alan's got a third round, but I just want to give others a chance before he jumps in one more time. Any other needs? Okay, Alan, you've got it.
Yeah, similar to Greg's question, which I read the packet, 119 pages, by the way, on this particular item. Congratulations, Lydia. What was missing for me, I got here's option 2A, here's option 2B, and all that. Here's the things that we could do or could have to implement those. But I really didn't get a sense of how complicated that was and how much effort and time it is. It's obviously more than the simple, straightforward, this just applies everywhere. But I'm wondering if we could get from staff a little bit more analysis on what it would take to do 2A or 2B. And it's obviously more than 1, but what would it take and what would that look like? And that would be really helpful as we go into the discussion about which option to take.
Yeah, and I think we're having, like I said, the public hearing next Monday. We haven't got a deliberations date scheduled yet, but it should be sometime in October, we're hoping. And so it's likely that the packet for your deliberations, we can try to flesh some of these things out so that you'll have them.
Monday. What are you doing this weekend, Lydia?
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would also just add to that the Planning Commission spent a lot of time on this. So you can also connect with Planning Commission members or send inquiries to them as well about some of their thinking and some of their thought process through this. So that's an important resource for counselors to remember they have colleagues who have spent some time on this issue. Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to concur with Councilor Groves and say, I know that for those who agree with the policy goals of this statewide mandate, that, reducing carbon emissions seems like something that may be produced as a long-term goal here, and that might be a good thing for an awful lot of people. I would agree that it absolutely will not. It's my point of view, it will increase carbon emissions as a function of people driving around a lot more because it can't find a place to park. I don't think it will incentivize people to stop driving their cars. I don't believe that's going to take place, and I believe they're missing the opportunity, as Alan mentioned, to do this on a more intelligent timetable and have more public buy-in in a more incremental fashion. I think it's the absolute wrong way to go. And for those that are paying attention and watching this from home, this is yet another example. I'm going to backtrack again and say that one of the things I hate most about this is the top-down state imposition of this rather than something that we develop locally. And so I would remind those that statewide elections and state legislative elections have consequences. And this is, in my opinion, another version of the consequences that come from We Know Best legislating from Salem. And I would encourage people to communicate with their legislators on this as well. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. If there are no other questions, we're really at time, and so I'm going to close off this conversation. You have a public hearing next week. There's time to come back. So thank you all. I think with that, it's probably time to close this out. And while people are making that transition, I will formally close out of this. Let's see. I'll close out of adjourn the meeting of the City Council and call the meeting to order of the Eugene Urban Renewal Agency. And with that, I will again turn it over to the manager.
Thank you, Mayor. Happy to be back here with this team talking about the Downtown Urban Renewal District. I have a couple of comments I want to make about the draft plan that I think I'm going to wait and make at the end, but I will remind you at the beginning, all the things you got in your packet are still in draft form. And so even since they've been printed and you've received them, we're continuing to see things that might need to change. And I'll come back to that after Amanda and team does their presentation.
Thanks, Sarah. I will pull up my presentation. Whoops, too fast. Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Amanda D'Souza, and I am the Development Programs Manager in the Community Development Division. In November 2022, the agency board considered the future of the Riverfront Urban Renewal District and directed staff to bring back a proposed amendment, which I'm here to present for your consideration. Before I dig into the proposed amendment, I'll quickly give a summary of the existing Riverfront Urban Renewal District, which was originally created in 1985. The current spending limit, also known as maximum indebtedness, is $34.8 million. The district is set to sunset in June of next year, and the plan was amended in 2004 and 2018. The 2004 amendment established the current spending limit and sunset date, and it expanded the district by about 34 acres. The district was amended twice in 2018 to add just under 2 acres for the railroad quiet zone and to add parcels north of 4th Avenue that are part of the downtown riverfront redevelopment. In general, urban renewal funds can be used for the purchase of real property, rehab or construction of buildings, site improvements, and improvements to streets, sidewalks, and utilities, essentially anything associated with capital improvements. Projects associated with operations like street cleaning or public safety services are not eligible. To remind you what's included in the district, I'll bring up a map of the plan area, which is also on the last page of attachment D. The riverfront plan area covers the land between Franklin Boulevard and the Willamette River, stretching from I-5 in the east over to Pearl Street in the west, where it meets up with the downtown district. Most of the activity in the riverfront district has been focused on the western portion of the plan area, including land acquisition and construction of infrastructure for the development of the federal courthouse and redevelopment of eWeb's former industrial yard into the downtown riverfront neighborhood. I'll briefly zoom in to show you how the two urban renewal districts coexist in the downtown area, since it's often forgotten that the riverfront district actually includes areas that some consider to be part of the downtown core. This is something for you to keep in mind as you consider the proposed amendment and project focus areas. Next, I'll start walking through the draft proposed amendment. The draft amendment is in attachment A, and attachment B is the draft report on the urban renewal plan, which provides information on the current conditions of the district and the financial impact of the proposed amendment. A lot of the content you'll hear today will look and feel familiar, and that's on purpose. In drafting this amendment, we approach it the same way we did the downtown amendment, outlining specific and strategic project focus areas that would be eligible for tax increment funding. This allows the agency board to establish spending parameters in the plan while maintaining some flexibility and responsiveness to evolving needs during implementation. Today, I'll cover two pieces: the proposed project focus areas and the spending scenarios, and Maurizio will discuss the fiscal implications of the proposed amendment. Your discussion today is focused on whether you want to initiate the formal amendment process and move on to public outreach. Should you choose to do that, any decisions on whether to actually amend the district would come later this fall. I'll start with the proposed project focus areas. The proposed amendment includes two sets of project focus areas, existing activities, which includes the steam plant and downtown riverfront affordable housing, and new activities, which are the 3 project focus area buckets that were included in the downtown amendment and emerged from the downtown priorities and projects effort. That includes housing, physical improvements to address safety and comfort, and emerging projects directed or initiated by the agency board. Since the western portion of the riverfront plan area includes a number of urban blocks that can be considered part of the downtown core, and that many of the challenges in downtown are also present in the riverfront, we strategically included these so the same tools would be available in the riverfront district as well. So I'll talk through these in a little bit more detail. First, the STEAM plan. As you know, the agency board selected a local team to lead redevelopment of the building. Their proposed project includes a ground floor accessible to the community and a hotel on the upper floors that provides the fiscal foundation. The board approved deal points with the team in January 2022, but a financial gap estimated to be $6.3 million remains in order for the adaptive reuse project to move forward. We feel the project is at a critical juncture and anticipate looking to the board for direction soon, whether or not the plan is amended. The other existing project is the downtown riverfront affordable housing, which we've also referred to as Parcel 2, and is located at the northwest corner of 4th and Mill. The agency board approved terms that call for the project to be no less than 75 units and affordable to households with incomes at or below 60% of area median income. Building affordable housing is more difficult than ever, and we know we'll need to invest in it to make the project feasible. We estimate an investment of around $5 million is needed to make it pencil. Next, I'll touch on the 3 focus area buckets that are carried over from the Downtown Urban Renewal Amendment. For the sake of time, and since we presented all these fairly recently, my summaries will be brief, but we'll be happy to answer any questions you have about them. The housing bucket includes 2 projects to support the creation of housing. The first is a development fee assistance, which would pay for government-imposed development fees for new housing, such as system development charges and permit fees. And then real property acquisition allows for the agency board to acquire property and offer it for reduced or no cost for new housing development. Both of these help to offset construction costs to make housing financially feasible. There are a number of underutilized properties in the western portion of the district, and you can probably identify properties you'd like to see turn into housing. One opportunity site is the city-owned parking lot at 8th and Pearl. Should council be interested in converting the surface parking lot into housing, the city could offer the site for no cost, and the agency could use development fee assistance to help make the project financially feasible. The next bucket carried over from the downtown amendment is physical improvements to address safety and comfort. This allows the agency to make physical improvements to street, curb, sidewalks, and other right-of-way in the plan area to create safe, accessible, and welcoming spaces for users. Examples of ways we can address safety and comfort include fixing pavements and sidewalks and improving the multimodal connections between the downtown core, the downtown riverfront, and the new developments along Broadway. The third focus area bucket carried over from downtown is referred to as emerging projects directed or initiated by the agency board. For the proposed riverfront amendment, these are a mix of projects the agency board has discussed before and projects that align with the downtown priorities and projects. In this bucket, possible projects include parking and mobility infrastructure to accommodate the increase of residents and visitors in the riverfront district. This could range from activities like expanding bike share facilities to providing more parking. Another possible project is supporting eWeb in the effort to reroute the transmission lines that service the Willamette substation and currently run from the electrical tower in the Riverfront Park. The agency board could also choose to pursue open space projects in the Riverfront plan area, like continuing the improvements along the South Bank bike path east of the Riverfront Park. And finally, the agency board could provide financial assistance to support the revitalization of vacant storefronts and underutilized properties. If the proposed plan amendment were approved, the agency board would need to provide direction before any of these projects could move forward. All 4 require additional study and strategy before they could be pursued. And by including them in the plan amendment now, they become eligible for urban renewal funds, meaning the agency board can choose to initiate them without having to amend the plan. Like we did with the downtown amendment, the proposed riverfront amendment includes 3 possible spending scenarios for you to consider. Each scenario has a different increase to the spending limit or maximum indebtedness. Spending scenario A is focused on completion of the 2 outstanding downtown riverfront projects, the steam plant and affordable housing. The scenario assumes most of the spending limit increase would be allocated to those 2 projects, with a small amount of money available for any emerging projects initiated by the agency board. The scenario includes a $15 million increase to the spending limit, which is estimated to extend the district by about 5 years. Spending scenario B includes those 2 outstanding projects, but also includes the 3 focus area buckets: housing, physical improvements, and emerging projects. Under this scenario, the spending limit would increase by $25 million, estimated to extend the district by about 8 years. Spending scenario C is similar to B, with a spending limit increase of $45 million and even more funds allocated to the new focus area buckets, especially housing. It's estimated that this would extend the district by about 15 years. I won't spend too long on this slide, but this is a summary of what's included in each spending scenario. You can see this information on the last page of attachment C. As a reminder, these are just estimated allocations, and the actual amounts will depend on future agency board action. Each of these numbers is scalable based on the board's interest. You'll note that the project numbers in the middle don't add up to the spending limit increase, and that's because we budgeted about 10 to 15% of the spending limit increase to project delivery administration. Project delivery costs include everything from staffing, attorney fees, and borrowing costs to appraisals and environmental reviews. Basically all the tasks needed to implement the projects. I'll now hand it off to Maurizio from Finance to discuss the fiscal components of the drafted proposed amendment.
Thanks, Amanda. Again, my name is Maurizio Badalico from Finance, and I'll be reviewing the fiscal implications of the proposed plan amendment. If the plan is amended, annual tax increment revenue, which was $3.4 million in FY23, will continue to be collected by the Riverfront District and will grow over time up to a legal limit that we'll review in more detail later. The tax increment revenue could be spent on eligible projects in the plan area. If the plan is ultimately not amended and the agency discontinues tax increment collection, the funds would instead be directed to the overlapping taxing districts. Under this scenario, based on FY23 data, the city's general fund would receive about $1.4 million per year. The county's general fund would receive an estimated $249,000 per year. And an estimated $928,000 would be collected on behalf of School District 4J, but due to a state school funding mechanisms and property tax compression, 4J would actually see a net decrease of $45,000 per year to their budget if tax increment stopped being collected. So now I'm going to introduce 2 topics that impact the financial forecast for the Riverfront District. I'll briefly introduce each topic and then revisit them again later with a couple of charts that will help us visualize how these items impact the tax increment projection. The first topic is the frozen base increase. You may recall the current adopted budget includes an additional $400,000 of property tax revenue annually for the city's general fund starting in FY25. This action can be accomplished through a frozen base increase in the proposed amendment of the Riverfront Urban Renewal Plan. The financial forecast for the proposed amendment assumes the frozen base assessed value is permanently increased from $50.6 million to $110.4 million. The effect of this is that this frozen base increase redirects $800,000 per year from the Riverfront District to the overlapping taxing districts. The city's general fund will receive about half of this amount, and the remainder goes to the other overlapping taxing districts. The next topic I would like to introduce is revenue sharing, which is a newer state mandated requirement that has not yet occurred in either of our urban renewal districts. Revenue sharing results from a legal limit on the amount of tax increment revenue that an urban renewal district can collect in any 1 year. Revenue from assessed value growth in the plan area beyond the limit is shared with the overlapping taxing district. The annual limit for the Riverfront District is anticipated to be 12.5% of the initial maximum indebtedness, which would be $4.35 million. So now let's walk through the tax increment revenue projection for the Riverfront District, and we'll see the impact of the frozen base increase and revenue sharing. First, let's orient ourselves with the layout of this chart. On the vertical axis on the left, we have net tax increment revenue. And on the horizontal axis on the bottom, we have years. The purple star indicates that we are now in FY24, which is the first year of the current biennium. The vertical dash line between FY24 and FY25 indicates the transition from the existing plan, which will sunset at the end of FY24, to the new plan amendment, which would extend tax increment collection to FY25 and beyond. The red stop signs along the bottom indicate the estimated final year for each of the 3 spending scenarios that Amanda reviewed earlier. So the first part of the projection shows an increase in tax increment revenue between FY23 and FY24, driven by a large new apartment building called Union on Broadway coming on the tax roll. The projection, which then drops in FY25 for 2 reasons. The primary reason is the frozen base increase, which reduces revenue for the Riverfront District in order to provide additional revenue to the overlapping taxing districts. The second reason is that the Riverfront District will be legally required to transition from a standard rate plan to a permanent rate plan following adoption of the plan amendment. The result of this change is that fewer tax levies will be subject to the Urban Renewal Division of Tax, which reduces tax increment revenue for the Riverfront District. Tax increment revenue is then projected to grow again, driven by another large new apartment building called the Standard, which is anticipated to be added to the tax roll in FY26. Moving ahead, there is continued growth of tax increment revenue driven by the expiration of the 10-year multi-unit property tax exemption for the 515, which was formerly known as the Hub. Revenue sharing then kicks in a couple years later. The anticipated annual limit of $4.35 million is projected to be exceeded for the first time in FY29, which then triggers revenue sharing to start the following year in FY30. Beyond FY30, revenue sharing will limit tax increment revenue growth for the Riverfront District. The annual revenue remains flat, except for a small drop at the end because less revenue will be needed in that final year to reach full maximum indebtedness. On the next slide, we'll see the impact of revenue sharing on the overlapping taxing district. So now I'll show the combined tax revenue for all taxing districts generated from assessed value within the Riverfront Plan area. This chart has the same layout as the previous slide, except the vertical revenue axis on the left goes much higher because the revenue for all taxing districts will be stacked together. Let's start with the frozen base. Tax revenue generated from the frozen base goes to the overlapping taxing district, and the city's general fund receives about half of this amount. You can see the frozen base increase in FY25 provides additional revenue to the overlapping taxing districts. Next is the tax increment revenue that goes to the Riverfront Urban Renewal District. This section has the same shape as the line we saw on the previous slide, except that here it's stacked on top of the frozen base. The final portion of tax revenue is generated from revenue sharing. Revenue from assessed value growth beyond the limit is shared with the overlapping taxing districts. Similar to the frozen base, the city's general fund will receive about half of this amount. The significant growth in revenue sharing in the out years of this forecast is largely driven by the private taxable development currently underway at the downtown Riverfront redevelopment site. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Amanda to wrap up the presentation.
Thanks, Maurizio. So if you wanted to keep exploring the use of urban renewal in the Riverfront, the next step would be to formally initiate the plan amendment process. Should you do that, you would then incorporate any feedback you have into the draft amendment, notify the general public about the proposed amendment, seek concurrence from overlapping taxing districts, take the amendment to the Planning Commission and River Guides, and hold a public hearing. You would then have another work session estimated for mid-November to review recommendations and public comment and refine the amendment if needed. And then later in November, you would make a final decision on whether or not to amend the Riverfront Urban Renewal Plan. As I mentioned, if the plan amendment is approved, implementation of projects will be guided by the agency board. Here's what that would look like for each of the projects and focus areas. For the steam plant, if you would like to allocate additional funds to the project, we'd bring back revised terms for a development agreement. For the downtown riverfront affordable housing, you'd consider a disposition process, project criteria, and financial assistance. For housing projects, staff is already in the process of drafting a proposed development fee assistance program. If this does get included in the Riverfront Amendment, that program could apply in the Riverfront Plan area as well. And we would also bring any possible property acquisitions, dispositions, and deal points to you. For physical improvements, we would start initiating small projects, and agency board direction would be needed on projects over $250,000. And for emerging projects, agency board direction or initiation would be needed to implement any of the eligible activities. In addition to these touch points, we would convene the River Guides to provide recommendations on activities in the district, and allocation of funds to projects would happen during your regular budget processes. I'll end on the options for you today. If you would like to continue exploring the proposed amendment and move to the next phase, which includes public outreach, you can choose to formally initiate the plan amendment process, seeking feedback on spending scenario A, B, or C. You could seek feedback on a modified spending scenario, or you could take no action at this time. The agency director recommends option 1. And with that, I will hand it back to Sarah for some final comments.
Thank you, Amanda. Have a couple more comments now that you finished, because it feels like every time we have this conversation, I feel like you can't say enough times that when you're going through this process that you're simply sort of determining what's eligible and what numbers might be eligible. But any final decisions about what you would want to invest in the steam plant, if anything, is made at a future time, and it could be up to, or it could be none of that. So it's really just more of a plan and eligibility. The project I wanted to talk about that wasn't in the draft is the eligibility of City Hall. And that was very specific. The last Riverfront just said City Hall was one of the eligible uses. Even though I don't anticipate like a City Hall project, we have a way to sort of work on that and finance it. There is, I do want to add it back in as at least eligible in the emerging projects, because the opportunity to do something in the north building on the second floor, if we want to have a great community space that's on the river, the ADA needs for that facility are beyond anything we would be able to fund right now. So it would hold it as a potential at some point if you decide, hey, we'd like the upper floor of that to be a community space as people have imagined it. We're probably going to need to make some investments to make that happen. So with that, I'll turn it over back to the mayor, and we're all here to answer questions.
That's great. Thank you so much for this presentation. And we have a lineup. So I have Mike and Greg first.
Thank you, Mayor. And City Manager, I appreciate your bringing in the comments regarding City Hall. I actually had 2 sets of comments regarding your presentation. And Amanda, thank you very much. And staff, everybody, Maurizio as well. One of the things I brought up previously, and we had at least some council conversation around at a couple of different times, budget, I believe as well, was the idea of including potential Station 17 here. I didn't, and I'm just wondering about the decision not to give us any kind of preliminary cost information there. Is that just, is there a reason for that? That we didn't include that in the presentation?
It's so, I mean, I can say we didn't include it because to me that would have been an emerging project without a lot more work around what does that look like, where would it be, what would it cost. It's not imminent. It's something that still needs to be studied.
I would like us to have that. I mean, I'm very much in favor of the idea of moving forward with expanding the district in the fashion proposed by staff under option 1. However, I would like to have us have that option to use that for a Station 17 as well, probably sooner rather than later, at least within the long-term time frame of Mauricio's maps and charts that he listed. So I heard in a non-specific, calculation, but kind of a guesstimate of what those numbers look like to be about 5 or 6 million. Is there any way we can know a better number without a huge degree of staff work?
No, and I can't imagine.
That came from
to me,
Chief Cave, and I'll out him on that one.
I understand that, but it's very difficult for me to imagine building a fire station for $5 million, given the costs that we're seeing for even the farmers market pavilion. So I think identifying it as an emerging project and eligible project and being conscious about the spending cap is appropriate. I think it'd be very difficult to come up with a specific number. And I mean, I can concur. I can talk with staff and see like how close and how do we need to do this to make it work so you get where you're trying to get.
That's really all I'm looking for is how do we make sure we don't preclude that option at some point. I would hope that we would be making decisions about that before 2029. So I just want to make sure we don't remove that from the table as an option to do with this fund at that time. Okay. Thank you, Manager. I appreciate that.
All right. Thank you, Greg, and then Randy.
Thank you, Mayor. If I can call staff's attention to attachment C, page 194, and specifically I'm zeroing in on the steam plant. Now we've already allocated $1.5 million of support for the project for the redevelopment of the steam plant. Can I get a little more specific in terms of the gap, the $6.3 million gap, in terms of what items we're talking about financially supporting in order to close that gap with the steam plant?
Yeah, so the deal points that the agency board has already approved was about 1.5 million to support that. And so that was for asbestos abatement, for just demo, SDCs, things like that. When we last brought you the project early last year, there was still a $5 million gap that remained in the project. And it's just a very complicated building, as you'd imagine. And trying to adaptively reuse it, very expensive. And at the time, we did reach out to the state for funds, and the state chose not to fund it. And so that gap remains, and it is continue to only grow. And so that just with the financing costs, interest rates have doubled since we last brought the project to you. And that's why that gap has grown. And just looking at their financial models, the gap remains in developing the project.
So included in that gap, what I'm trying to determine is what specific items are we looking to finance? Are we doing infrastructure financing? Are we doing what kinds of things are needed to make that go?
Yeah, so
they're increasing the cost of it.
Yeah, I don't have the information right now, and I'm happy to kind of look back at their model, work with the team to identify what are pieces that we could assist with. So it might be like selective demolition in the building would help them. And so I'd be happy to work with the team and bring back that information and on what we could cover.
That would be real helpful for me, because I think that we need to provide the public with as much clarity as possible about what we are spending this money on if we decide to spend this money.
Okay, we will work on that.
Okay, thank you, Randy, and then Alan.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll start with the potential for the fire station, Station 17. Yeah, I have no idea what the costs are, but a lot of it's going to depend on what kind of fire station is put in there. Will it be a single engine company? Will it be an engine medic station? Will it be a multi-company station with a ladder truck? Those are all different sizes and different costs. To me, I would think it'd be a multi-company station with all the high rise and condensed living situations that have been built in that area, including Franklin Boulevard. Just for cost comparison, Station 1 at 13th and Willamette, which is a multi-company station, was passed with a bond in 2002 for $10 million, give or take. But over $1 million of that was used for a Class A burn building at 2nd and Chambers. We took possession of that and staffed and opened it in 2005. So there's been some significant inflation since that time, especially in the last few years. So the next thing, is there any blight in the Riverfront District?
Yep. Yes. So let me get my talking point. So it's a great question, Councilor Groves. So one of the main goals of urban renewal is to address blighted areas of the community. That's the whole reason the program exists. And so in order to establish the urban renewal district or amend one, we do need to demonstrate that the area is blighted. The Oregon state statutes include include 9 definitions of blight that can range from unfit buildings to inadequate infrastructure to an unproductive use of land. And so as part of the blight analysis, we evaluate how many properties in the plan area fit those definitions. We are still in the process of completing the blight analysis. It's quite a comprehensive evaluation. But one of the examples is a statistic we use is to look at the prevalence of properties with depreciated values, which is an indicator of inefficient economic use. And so for the Riverfront Plan area, we actually have found that 2/3 of the tax lots have depreciated values. And so should you choose to move forward with the amendment process, the full blight analysis will be included in the draft ordinance that will eventually go to public hearing and will eventually come to you for your consideration.
Thank you, Amanda. I think that's going to be very important information for the public should we decide as a body here to move forward. Another question I had with regard to the U of O land swap, do we have any idea with the 8 acres that we would be getting that would extend the riverfront project into and still be in that riverfront district? Do we have any idea of cost needs to bring that online?
Good question. I think I will look to Denny or Sarah for that question.
I'm happy to jump in. It's a good question. The property is in the riverfront district currently. At this point, what we would anticipate is that being part of our park inventory. It's currently owned by the U of O. It's part of a CUP that under the current CUP, there's no development possible within 200 feet of the river and so forth. So even in its current form, it has limited development potential. And if we stuck with that kind of development objective, most of it we would anticipate to be open space. There might be some area along the railroad tracks, for example, that you might consider developable. But at this point, I think we're really looking at kind of an extension of the riverfront park and the extension of the open space possibilities that kind of evolve over time given the new riverfront neighborhood.
Okay, thank you. That's something I'm interested in as we go forward, learning more about what the needs would be, because it's, I'm concerned about as we take on land, what are we going to do with it? Although I do support the swap. My last question is, can City Hall work be paid for out of the district? Meaning even the current work that we're looking at doing that could potentially free up some of our facilities funds. Can that be taken and drawn from the increment financing?
I believe so. So City Hall is currently identified as an eligible project in the plan as it currently exists. And if we add it back in as an emerging project, it would remain, or the same language into the current plan amendment, it would be eligible. And it looks like Lauren might chime in as well.
I agree with what Amanda just said. I just wanted to clarify when we say add it back in, what we mean is it's not currently in the proposed plan amendment. It is currently in the adopted plan. And so it wouldn't really be adding it back in. It would just be continuing that as an eligible project through the next plan amendment.
I'm thinking in terms of, balloon payment down the road as a way of potentially covering that without having to come up with other sources of money.
So you're talking about the 4 million that we still owe?
Yes. And that would be a legitimate use of that fund, those funds then.
Yeah, I want to make sure we're rock solid on that we would be able to do that. It sounds like it probably is, but I want to just make sure that it's okay to go back and pay sort of a debt and it's not actually an improvement. So I just want to double verify that.
I think that's good. Measure twice, cut once.
Measure 3 times and still cut the wrong spot.
Measure 3 times, don't cut at all. Anyway, that's all I have. Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, staff.
Okay, thank you, Alan, and then Emily.
Yeah, Amanda, Mauricio, really good summary, very clearly explained something that's very complicated. So good job. I made it clear before I don't like urban rural districts and would rather they sunsetted, but that isn't even close to a majority on the council. So I won't belabor the point. There are other options like increasing the frozen base for so many different needs that we have in the general fund. I think we should explore, but I don't think that's going to happen either. My interest in all of this, having said all that, is housing, more housing, and as much as possible. I don't consider the steam plant hotel to be housing. By definition, that's for visitors, not residents. So I don't put that in that category. The option with the most housing is the one I would prefer. I will point out the irony of having a conversation about taking a parking lot downtown after the CFEC conversation and turning it into housing and taking away parking is a really good irony. But if you could pop up slide 17 for me. In option C, for instance, when you add the 5 and the 13.6, that's only 40% of the spending goes towards housing. And that's not even close to a majority. I thought we were talking about a majority of the spending going towards housing. So I would like to see an options on C that looked at increasing the amount for housing in the red bucket category, and probably by decreasing some of the 4.3 and 4.4 million in the physical improvements and emerging projects area. And see what that would look like and how much more housing we would be able to get. And what happens? So I'd like to see that option. Question, you could take that slide down. If the steam plant doesn't go forward, that 6.3 million can be redirected. Can we confine it to housing?
It's up to the agency board what would happen with that funds. If the steam plant didn't move forward, there would need to be funds spent to figure out what to do with the site. So even demolition, preparing the site, even if you wanted to turn into a park, as we've seen, parks also cost money to build. So it would be an agency board decision how those funds got allocated. Just like all the numbers on that slide, it's up to the agency board how the dollars will actually get spent. And I will point out for both scenarios B and C, the money allocated to the affordable housing column can count as housing, but I do hear your feedback on how the other buckets are allocated.
Yeah, I count it as housing. It wouldn't be the full 6.3 million, but some portion of it that could be directed. Could we add that as a thing that says, if this doesn't go forward, the remainder of the money available after resolution of that site goes towards housing? Can we add that to the
the allocations in the plan again aren't locked in, and so I think it would be
we could add that in as a statement. I also would like to see the new city hall and fire station 17 added in. I think that's a good idea. I don't know how that all is going to play out, but having the flexibility to be able to do that would be great. And lastly, the land swap, 8 acres, should be in parkland and open space as we promised in the swap deal points and not be developed. That wasn't what I voted for.
All right. Thank you, Alan. And Emily, you're up.
Thank you. Thank you for the good explanation. I know this is a topic that I've reviewed many times and it's finally getting more clear. So I did want to reiterate that we do not have to determine the limits for each project at this point. Do we have to determine it if this passes? And we have to put in any projects that we might want to work on, like City Hall and the fire station, or we would have to amend later to put that in?
Yeah, so let's see. We'll start with your first question. The state statutes require us to put in estimated allocations, which is why we put in estimated allocation. All of those numbers can change as once the plan's amended, those numbers can change as the agency board makes decisions on how to spend the money. And then in terms of projects, yes, projects need to be included in the amendment in order to be eligible. Just because it's in there doesn't mean they'll move forward. There is time, like now I think is the optimal time to include things since we're about to go for public outreach. So in terms of transparency, but there will be more opportunities before you're asked to make a decision on actually amending the plan to add more projects. If that makes sense.
Yes, thank you very much. I have some questions about projects that we approved before, and are they still funded? Such as the railroad quiet zone for $7 million. Do we still have that $7 million set aside, or did that go back into the bigger fund?
That is still set aside, and it's still in progress. I don't have the most up-to-date status on the project. I know they're still working with ODOT and the railroad on permitting things, but the funds are still allocated and set aside for that.
So if it costs more and we were in favor of it, could we put more money from this new amendment into a project we'd already started and approved the amount for?
I think I'm going to look to Lauren about the language. I think it could qualify as one of the existing buckets, but I'm going to look to you, Lauren.
It's a good question, Councilor Semple. I don't know that we've thought about it specifically in terms of the quiet zone, but we can certainly look back at the plan language and make sure that either, any project would be eligible or, present some language that would make sure that that's true.
Thank you. That's helpful. The two-way 8th Street, have we already found the money for that? Because it's listed here.
I don't know off the top of my head. I believe there has been urban renewal funds allocated, but maybe Denny or Will.
I thought maybe it was covered by something else, the TSP bond or something.
Possibly.
Well, I'd like to know.
Looks like Matt's jumping in. He'll also know.
Councilor Semple. So there's a mix of transportation funding that's in that project to make it whole, including some urban renewal. So my understanding right now is it doesn't need any additional funding.
Because we've already allocated it from previous urban renewal?
Well, I think as Amanda said, and I'll let her confirm, there's some portion of urban renewal, but the bulk of the project's being paid for with a federal grant. And then there's additional city transportation funds going in to support the work.
Okay. And the protected bike lane on High Street, I think that's already started. So is it funded? I'm just curious that we have this long list. And if we don't include it, we can't include it later. And is it already covered? Because then it doesn't need to be on the list. So those were the ones that I had picked out that I'd like to know about. And then on page 191, the impact of urban renewal on an individual tax bill. I thought that made no difference. They pay the property tax and then how is it divided? But down there it has both urban renewal districts with taxes after the reallocation. So I'm just confused about that.
I can comment on that quickly, Councilor Semple. That's a really great question. The important part of that table is the bottom right corner where it shows 0. Basically, what it's showing is that instead of the money going to the overlapping taxing districts, it's being redirected to the urban renewal districts, but the net impact on the tax bill itself is zero. So it's just showing the money moving around, but there's no difference in before or after urban renewal.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Jennifer.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank staff for this presentation. You guys always do a great job on this topic, which is really complicated, and I appreciate it. I think you did a really good job on the estimates. I agree with Alan. I would love to always see more money going towards housing, but I understand, we're just taking a stab at what we think it will look like, and we can always make changes. So I appreciate the job that you guys did. And I'm really anxious to move this along and hear what people think about the different options. So that would be my preference as a next step at this point. And thanks again for the presentation.
Okay, thank you. Randy, I know you're going to put a motion on the table. Do you also have a question to ask?
Thank you, Mayor. I'm withdrawing the question because of the time that we have here.
So I just want to make one comment, and then I'm going to turn to you for that motion. And I just want to comment a little bit on both Randy's question about blight and Alan's comment about the steam plant and the hotel. And I say, if anything defines blight, it is that steam plant. And that it really is the intention of urban renewal funds to address blight. And it really is the intention of the funds to do that in a way that promotes economic development. And that's what that steam plant project is an economic development. It's jobs and it's commerce that will happen in that plant. And otherwise it's simply a burden. So I very much hoping council moves forward on this. And I'm really hoping that the steam plant gets the funding it needs, because it's an iconic, beautiful structure and it's a local developer. And I would just love to see that move forward. And I think it is a perfect example of how urban renewal funds should be spent. So that's my pitch. And then I'm going to turn it over to Randy for a motion.
Thank you, Mayor. And I'm going to make this motion, but I'm just taking a stab at which of the three options. I don't have a good feel of where everybody is, so I would certainly entertain a friendly. Move to direct the agency director to begin the process of amending the Riverfront Urban Renewal Plan using spending scenario B, consistent with the draft plan and report included in attachments A and B.
Do we have a second from someone?
I'll second.
Thank you. Alan, you want to speak to it?
Yeah, can't we move forward all three of them?
So I think if that's what the agency board would like to do, one thing is whatever the spending limit we take to the public outreach to the taxing district sets the maximum. So if you were to move forward with B and the $25 million, you then couldn't later this fall choose scenario C because it's above what the taxing districts considered. But if you move forward with the 45 million, you could always reduce it later on in the process. But if we would like to seek feedback on all three scenarios, that is something we could do.
So, Randy, would you accept a friendly that said on spending scenario A, B, or C?
Yes.
The second accepts it.
Okay, great. Matt, Mike, do you have a comment on that?
I was going to make that motion if the friendly was not accepted.
Okay. All right. So we have a motion on the table. Any other questions or comments about that? All in favor? Oh, yeah. Emily, go for it.
New computer. I am concerned that if we put out that 45 million, we get stuck into it, and I'm not 100% against it, but I am concerned that it gets to be a big fund that could go to a lot of different projects, and I don't want it to be seen as a slush fund. Thanks.
So my understanding,
I'll vote for it, but I would really like to look at all three.
Okay. Well, and the motion on the table is for all three.
Right.
So, Randy.
I was just going to say, just because we have allocated doesn't mean we have to spend it.
Okay. All right. All in favor of the motion on the table, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That passes unanimously. Thank you all very much. And Thank you, Amanda and Mauricio. Really great presentation. Very helpful. Great conversation. Good questions, council. Thank you so much. We are adjourned.